Think of all your blessings, like your family, your job, you have money in the bank, maybe you have a vehicle to drive. Some of you are healthy, you have a roof over your head. We have so much to be thankful for. But what about spiritually? What about Jesus? See, sometimes we forget that we have something so amazing as a follower of Christ. But do we really thank Him for it? Today, David is going to be very thankful for God and what He has done in his life. So let's learn from him today. Join us. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Psalm series. Glad you are joining us. Today we are working through Psalm 34. So I want to start by asking a question, and that is, what are you thankful for? What are you thankful to God for? Because you should have a really, really long list, especially if you live in the United States. We have freedom. Most people have a job. Many people have families or children or grandchildren, or maybe you have money in the bank. You have food that you can put on the table, a roof over your head, a vehicle to drive. And those things we should be thankful for on a regular basis. But what about spiritually? Like, do you thank Jesus for everything He's done for you? Because I don't know if I think about that enough, and I should. Because think about what He did. He died on a cross. He paid for my sins. He reconciled me back to a relationship with God. And someday I get to spend eternity in heaven with Him. But even more than that, God lives within me. If I have surrendered my life to Jesus, then He lives inside of me. He leads me in my life. He guides me. He promises to make all things work together for good, even the bad that's happening in my life. He gives me peace. He gives me joy in the midst of trouble. But do we thank Him for those things on a daily basis? Probably not. Stephen Lawson tells us a story that hopefully will help us understand this lesson today. We'll scroll it on the screen so you can read this along. Over a century ago, Northwestern University, located in Lake Michigan, near Chicago, had a voluntary life-saving crew among its students. One of these crews became famous for rescuing shipwrecked sailors. On September 8, 1860, just off the shore of Lake Michigan and near the college campus, the Lady Elgin, a crowded passenger steamer, went down. Answering the emergency distress call, a life-saving team at Northwestern University immediately formed themselves into rescue teams and launched out into the waters. Among the students that perilous day was Edward Spencer, a young man who was preparing for ministry. Seeing a woman clinging to some wreckage far out in the waters, Spencer threw off his coat and swam out through the heavy waves, successfully rescuing her and pulling her back to the shore. 16 more times that day, young Spencer braved the fierce wave, saving a host of lives. Exhausted and spent, this heroic young man collapsed from fatigue. Spencer never completely recovered from the exposure of that near-tragic day. With broken health, he lived quietly the rest of his life in relative seclusion, disabled, unable to enter the work of ministry. Many years later, R.A. Torrey, a pastor of Moody Memorial Church in Chicago, was telling about this incident at a meeting in Los Angeles, when a man in the audience called out that Edward Spencer was actually in the audience. Torrey invited Spencer to the platform. An old man with white hair slowly climbed the steps to the pulpit as the applause rang out. Torrey asked him if anything in particular stood out in his memory. "Only this, sir," Spencer replied. "Of the 17 people I saved, not one of them thanked me." This actually is tragic, but it actually happened to Jesus also. Look at Luke 17:11. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go show yourself to the priest." And they went and they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except the foreigner?" See, Jesus knows how it feels because he healed these men, and only one of them came back and even said thank you. So today, what we're going to learn from David is he does not want to be that ungrateful guy, because he knows that God alone is the one who protected him and kept him safe when he was on the run from King Saul. So to set this psalm up, David has been on the run from the king for so long because Saul is jealous of him. Saul wants David dead. Saul's been chasing David all over the mountains in Israel. And David is exhausted, and he is tired of running. So he goes to a place called Nob. It's near Jerusalem. It's a city of Jewish priests. So David shows up, and he actually lies because he's starving to get some food, and he asks for a sword because he doesn't have any weapons. So they actually give him the sword that he killed Goliath with. That's where this sword was. So David fled to Philistine country, the actual home of Goliath. And the Philistines were Israel's arch enemies. They were always fighting. It was the Philistines against the Israelites. But David knew that King Saul would never dare go into Philistine country looking for him. So that's where he went, because he was so tired of running. And the only thing David could do would be to trust God to protect him in a foreign land where everyone who knew David probably want to kill him. So we see this scene. First, let me put up this, I'll put up this map here so you can see the grayed area over there where it says Philistine. So that would be considered Philistine country. If you can look kind of halfway down, sort of under the T-I-N of Philistines, is Gath, okay? So the white area would be where King Saul, Israel, the Philistine country would be that particular portion of it. So we read this in 1 Samuel 21:10. That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. So he's now in Philistine country. But the servants of Achish said to him, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Like, David, are you serious? So Achish said to the servants, "Look at that man. He's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house?" But that is how exhausted that David was and just tired of it all. David was at the end of his rope, and he went to enemy territory. And most everyone knew in that land what David looked like, who he was. And David knew going into this land that no one's going to trust him. In fact, it would be a notch on their belt if they killed him. And the only thing he could do was trust God with his life. In fact, the good news is that David had a plan. God had a plan for David's life. And knowing that, David could sit back and relax. God, I'm trusting you with my life. You're the only one that can protect me in here, so you're going to have to do that. It's actually a really good place to be. So David leaves from there, and he goes to a cave. 1 Samuel 22:1. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. And maybe this is when David wrote this psalm, a psalm of gratefulness that he made it to this cave, a gratefulness that God protected him and saved his life. So we'll pick up this psalm in verse 1. It says, the Psalm of David when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he left. Verse 1 says this, I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. My soul will boast in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name. David breaks out in this praise and worship for his God. Why? Verse 4 tells us, I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Isn't that great? I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from not only my situation, but from my fears. So think about what you're afraid of. The cancer? The bill that just came in? The court date? The loss of your job? Like, what are you afraid of? If so, you need to read and memorize this particular psalm and this particular verse, okay? I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Whatever you are afraid of, you need to just hand them over to God, because he is big enough to take care of. If he's big enough to take care of David in enemy territory where everyone knows who he is, God can take care of you and whatever your problem is that you're dealing with. Because that's what I've loved about this entire Psalm series, is the one thing we keep learning over and over and over again is this, that God is that big. We're not here alone on this earth. He's that big. He takes care of us on this earth. Verse 5 says this, those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called and the Lord heard him. He saved him out of all of his troubles. David's like, this is my story. I'm like a poor man. I have no resources to bring about my own rescue. But God heard me and he saved me. Verse 7 says, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. David had this great relationship with God. He adored God. He trusted God. He was in awe of God. And David wants us to know that when we can get to that point, that God encamps around us and will deliver us. The angel of the Lord in this particular verse probably is a reference to a pre-incarnate Jesus. We see him step onto this earth all throughout the Old Testament. But the point is that God knows who truly loves him, and God knows who truly fears him. And that matters to God. God says, I'm gonna encamp around those who love me and fear me. Verse 8 says this, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. If you are struggling with something in your life, David says, taste and see. Taste and see that the Lord is good. If someone handed me a brownie, I'm not going to know if it's good unless I actually taste it and see if it's actually a good brownie. And the same is true with what David is saying. He's like, taste the Lord, try him, test him, let him show you that he really is good. And he goes on to say, you will be blessed when you take refuge in him. So many of us take refuge in everything else, our job, our bank accounts, our marriage, our friends, our hobbies, whatever. But when you take refuge in God alone, when you spend the time to get to know him by reading his word, by learning to trust him, that's when everything in our life will change. I love this psalm because David is always pointing us back to come to God, give your life to him. For us, it means giving our life to Jesus. Give your life to Jesus. The Holy Spirit, who's God, comes within us and lives within us. Take our refuge in him. That's the point. Verse 9 says this, fear the Lord, you his saints. For those who fear him lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. I love how David uses lions as an example. They're like the kings of the forest. And yet they can grow weak and they can grow hungry if they can't find food. But David says, when we seek the Lord, he'll always take care of us. We won't be like those lions who are like, I'm so starving to death. It's not going to be like that. Lions may lack food, but when we seek God, we don't have to worry about things like that. Verse 11 says, come, my children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. And David seems to link fear or reverence with the Lord with how we act. If we love God, we should actually act like it. Verse 12 says this, whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking lies. I thought this was funny. A woman from London once went to a preacher and told him that the bands that he was wearing around his pulpit gown, they were too long and they annoyed her greatly. She asked for permission to shorten them. And confident that he would agree, she brought along a pair of scissors. The pastor agreed and handed over, this so the woman can cut the bottoms of it. So she shortened it. She thanked him, and then he said to her, now my good woman, there is something about you that is altogether too long, which has annoyed me greatly. And since one good turn deserves another, I would like permission to shorten it. And she said, well, absolutely, you have permission to do so. Here's the scissors. So the pastor said, very well, madam, stick out your tongue. You're like, serious? But that's the point. Like, what we say really does matter, because what we say shows what we believe about God. Someone said once, usually the first screw that gets loose in a person's head is the one that controls the tongue. I thought that's so true. But as a follower of Jesus, what we say should actually reflect our faith. It should reflect how we act. Verse 14 says, turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. Don't gossip, don't be angry. Don't be a part of commotion. Seek peace. Seek peace with your spouse. Seek peace with that person at work, that person you don't get along with. Pursue peace, David says. Because it seems like David's making a point that those who really love God act like it. Those are the ones that God actually listens to. Look at verse 15. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. In other words, if we are living for ourselves, if we're doing things that we shouldn't be doing, God's not going to listen. He's not going to come through for us. Like, why would he? Verse 17, the righteous. Those that are, for us, it's those that are followers of Jesus, because we have the righteousness of Christ. The righteous cry out and the Lord hears them, and he delivers them from all their trouble. I love that. Verse 18, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. This is a great verse for some of those of you who have maybe lost a loved one, a spouse, a parent, a child, and you're just so sad because of it, or maybe you're so sad because someone hurt you. And yet this is a reminder that the Lord is close to you. He's close to the brokenhearted and those that are crushed in spirit. Some of you may want to put this verse on your refrigerator or on the mirror in your bathroom, because it's a great reminder that he's close to you. Verse 19 says, a righteous man may have many troubles, but the Lord will deliver him from all. We have to be careful to think as Christians that we're not going to have trouble in this life. Because all through the Bible, all the followers of Jesus and all the men of God in the Old Testament, they all had trouble, okay? That's just part of this. But what we know is that when it says this verse, but the Lord delivers him from all. Sometimes we get this feeling like, we'll take this verse and say, the Lord's going to deliver me because this verse says it. But remember, we have to take the Bible as a whole. We can't just stand on one verse without looking at the context of it. Because sometimes, just like David, God did deliver him from Saul. But sometimes God doesn't deliver us on this earth. Maybe he delivers us from our problems through death. Okay? We saw that with Jesus. But look at this. Look at the next verse. Verse 20, it says, he protects all his bones, not one of them will be broken. Now you're like, what does that have to do with anything? But it has everything to do with Jesus. Because this seems to be a prophecy concerning when Jesus died on a cross, and this was written 1,000 years before. Because when Jesus died on a cross, look at this in John 19:31. Therefore, because it was the preparation day that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. It's interesting how a lot of people will take verse 20 and say that's actually a prophecy of Jesus, because it says he protects all his bones, not one of them will be broken. And they didn't break his bones in his leg after he died on the cross. It's so fascinating. Verse 21 says, evil will slay the wicked. The foes of the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems his servants. No one will be condemned who takes refuge in him. And knowing this, that God redeems us through Jesus alone. That if you've given your life to Jesus, we're not going to be condemned for anything. We need to remember that what we learn in the psalm is that there's no condemnation, that God is near to the brokenhearted, that he leads us and he guides us with his eye upon us, and he saves us from evil. And that brings us full circle back to the 10 lepers, that only one came back and thanked Jesus. So this psalm is a reminder to us to be thankful, to be grateful for what God has done in our life. And how we can honor him is by how we act and what we say and what we do. There you go. Psalm 34. I love this psalm. So anyway, hope that helped you today. Hope you have a really good day.